I've been able to meet ministers whenever I've needed to. But I've communicated with all the ministers, the five that, I've tried to communicate with the 5 Home Secretaries and the 6 ministers that have been in place since I was appointed, that it's really important to get the subjective assessment of the Chief Inspector. I don't think it's good to go through the prism of senior civil servants, because it's in their interest to protect and play down things. I think it's really important that the independent person can communicate directly with the ministers and tell them what's going on. If you can't do that, then I think we're in trouble.
And so you've also met, I think, with James Cleverly, the latest Home Secretary.
I have. I met with James Cleverly just after Christmas, and I have to say, I was really impressed. I think it was positive. I think there's a change of tone in the department. I think the discussions with him were good, and I think there's lots of positives. And Minister Pursglove comes back into the department as well, and that relationship, we're picking up that relationship as well.
So, one of the key issues in this is about the reports that you write and them going into the Home Office and then seemingly disappearing for long periods of time and either not being published or being published after months and months. Could you just explain, so we all understand, what happens to your reports when you send them into the Home Office? And particularly, could you say something about what the Home Secretary said recently about factual inaccuracies in your last report around City Airport, and that had to be checked by the Home Office before it could be published? And also about the issue of redactions, just so we're all very clear about what happens to your reports and what the expectation is.
As part of the process that we have with the Home Office, we conduct field work, we conduct research, we produce a draft report, and then we have a formal process whereby we submit that for factual accuracy into the Home Office. The Home Office then will pick up the facts, we'll pick up errors perhaps that we've made, and then we respond formally to those factual accuracies back into the Home Office with a issue by issue submission, and then we send the report to the Home Secretary for it to be published. So we go through an extensive factual accuracy process on each and every report, and that's codified and laid down in the procedures that we have with the department. Now, it's not unusual for there to be disagreements in terms of the data. It's not unusual for there to be a disagreement with of facts, and sometimes the department pushes back considerably in the work that we do. But equally, when the reports are finally published, they often find that they agree with what we've said, and they roll back on some of the things that have gone through factual accuracy. So yes, we take on board any facts that we may have made a mistake with. But that doesn't. Most of our reports are pretty accurate, and most of them are sort of borne out by the test of time.
And so that final report that you put into the Home Office on the 14th of February, you stand by that as factually accurate?
I wouldn't have submitted the report and behaved in the way that I've done if I thought there was any doubts that what we'd put into the public domain wasn't accurate.
Okay. You've also provided for the committee a document which we are going to publish with the 10 challenges to make the ICIBI more effective. Would you just quickly like to go through that, and then we're going to have some questions from members. But this is really setting out, I think, a number of the concerns you have about what's happened over the last 3 years.
It is, thank you for that. And this really comes on the back of the Wendy Williams' work into Windrush and the Windrush Lessons Learnt review. You will recall I've appeared in this committee, in front of this committee before, where we talked specifically about recommendation 10, which is a commitment from the Home Secretary to review the terms, the role and remit of the ICIBI. So I came into this job 3 years ago expecting that to take place. It was, whilst it was agreed to by the Home Secretary, it was then turned off, I think about a year ago, so I think it was last January. So therefore there's been no progress in terms of how the ICIBI has developed. Now, I don't want this top 10 to seem as though that I should be looking into my former organisation to say that it's performing badly. Actually, these 10 areas are a good example of any organisation should look to improve itself, and should equally, most of this lies in the control of the Home Office, not of the ICIBI. But nevertheless, number one on the of the changes is independence. And the ability to self-publish our reports in the same way that Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons does, or Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary's Fire and Rescue, that's a fundamental. I saw Jill Rutter had written something last week talking about it being an absolute basic requirement for independence of the post to be able to put material into the public domain. Secondly, in terms of recommendations, Wendy Williams explicitly said that ministers should have a duty to publish clearly their articulated and justified reasons why they not agree to implement some of the ICIBI recommendations. Some of our recommendations that we've made are not are either accepted by the department and then not delivered. Some of them are part accepted and sort of obfuscated, and some of them are downright just not accepted at all. So there's a big issue there, I think, in terms of recommendations. Resilience, and this was written before the instance, before what's gone on the last week. There is a huge issue in terms of resilience of the Chief Inspector, because any gap in the Chief Inspector means that work stops. The job, it means the way that we're founded, means that the Chief Inspector is so intimately involved in all of the inspections that we're in a position now where work just stops until a new Chief Inspector is appointed, and that's really unsatisfactory in terms of our ability, or the ability for Parliament to hold to account the Home Office.
And just before you go on to the next one, can you just remind us how long it took for your appointment to actually, from when you applied to actually when you started in role? How many months did that take?
It's something almost nearly a year, I think.
Nearly
like
a year. So we're looking at up to a year, possibly, for a new Chief Inspector.
And certainly 6 to 9 months, as I understand it. And I can go on, Chair, to detail the 5 areas that I think will be impacted by my lack of reappointment, because I think that's quite important. I think that, so following up on resilience, cross-Whitehall inspection powers, because I think it's extremely important for the inspector to be able to cross over departmental boundaries. For example, if you were looking at Afghan resettlement, there are issues in there that sit within the FCDO and sit within the Ministry of Defence. My powers only extend as far as inspecting the Home Office. You'll recall, and I've mentioned it before in front of this committee, an excellent report in 2015 by the NAO that compared kindred inspectorates, so the HMI-C as was HMI Prisons, Probation, CPS, and it compared the ICIBI with those inspectorates and sought to get sort of sharing of experience, sharing of staff, commonalities, ultimately just to be able to save money. And that report is valid, is equally, it remains valid. And it's ironic that one of the things in that report talked about the relationship with the senior sponsor within the department, so the individual who's there to promote the ICIBI. Well, it was the senior sponsor that Teams called me to tell me I was dismissed from the department. So there is an irony somewhere in terms of those procedures. So I think the 2015 report is an excellent piece of work and a really good start point for anyone.
Sorry, you were, just to say that again, you were actually dismissed by Teams, did you just say?
Yes, I was, yeah. And worse than that, for my high-performing team of 30 civil servants, the notification that I was sacked was in the media before my team or I had the chance to speak to them, which is just shocking. Shocking leadership. I've said to this committee before that the quality of the staff that I've got, something between like 79 to 94% approval rating in that. We've got a really, really strong team, best in class within the Home Office. And for them, it's a real kick to find out, they're listening to the news at 6 to find that out. I think that the importance of asylum, migration, and the huge change that there's been in terms of the ICIBI as an institution mean that it should be granted, as far as I'm concerned, HMI status. So again, it can be complementary and be benchmarked against others, and we can improve. Redactions, you've mentioned that already. I think there is provision in the legislation for redactions in relation to national security or personal personal risk for individuals. I think that redactions, I've said it before, have been misused, and I think the threshold for redactions is too low. If there is a requirement to redact on the basis of that it might embarrass the department, or if there is a requirement to redact on the basis this might be of assistance to criminality, well then fair enough, but it needs to say that in the legislation. And I think a misuse of the redaction powers, or the potential misuse of the redaction powers, is dangerous. Resources, there is a resource review going on at the moment which sees a 5% cut year on year for our budget, in the same way the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner, who gave evidence a few weeks ago. This is against the backdrop of the size of the Home Office, the area that we investigate, growing by 88% since we were formed. So you've got this huge burgeoning, and with a sort of natural consequence that we can't examine anywhere near as much of the depth or the breadth of what we need to. Penultimately, access to commercial contracts. There have been struggles in the past where we've not been able to access the depth of commercial contracts, and I think that limits our independence and limits in what we can unearth. And then finally, and it's one of Wendy's recommendations, is the Migrants Commissioner. There is no Migrants Commissioner, so there is no one to represent the views of people who are in the system, asylum seekers and migrants who are in the system. I've worked really hard with stakeholder groups to understand as best I can their views, because I think they're an important stakeholder. But there isn't a Migrants Commissioner, and I think that's a shame as well. So those are the 10. I think it's important, but I would just stress that this is not an organisation that's not doing well of its own accord. I think we've reconfigured ourselves so we've got inspectors inspecting and producing quality reports that very rarely are ever questioned. And I think we play a central role in this debate.
Okay, that's very helpful, setting all that out for us. Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Neal, can I say I think some of us were, I think all of us were rather disappointed at your dismissal. We've always had a very good relationship with you on this committee, although it didn't necessarily start on that basis through no fault of everybody. And you've always been exceedingly proactive in wanting to engage with us more, not least when you invited us to go on joint inspection, so we could see the work that you do at first hand, better to enable us then to scrutinise it and to make recommendations to the Home Office, which still inexplicably was refused by the Home Office after ministers had initially said there was no objections to it. I recall back in November, soon after your contract, it was announced, was not going to be renewed. I asked you why, and you said largely you didn't really know at that stage. Would you like to revisit that answer in the light of the events of the last few weeks?
Well, I now know that the Home Office, so the ministers supported my reappointment, so not my extension, my reappointment, and the Home Secretary supported my reappointment. That reappointment process was sent to the Cabinet Office and then was sent on to number 10, and it was turned down by number 10. So I've no idea why it was turned down by number 10. The reason I know that it was approved or supported by the Home Office is because of disclosure material in relation to a judicial review that's sitting at the end of March that we've been exposed to. So I can't tell you why I've not been reappointed, but I can tell you that the Home Office, as far as I understand from material that's been disclosed to us, approved my reappointment.
There is a judicial review pending that's relevant to this.
There's a judicial review on the 21st and 22nd of March in relation to Manston, of which the ICIBI as an organisation is an interested party. And clearly I'm not going to be involved in that judicial review now, although I'll be interested to see how it plays out.
The relevance of that to number 10 in your position is what, do you think?
I can't say whether there's any relevance to that at all, but what I can say is that material that was disclosed to the judicial review, which I have seen, would indicate that my reappointment was supported by ministers within the Home Office. Now, whether or not there is subsequent material that's disclosed to that judicial review that then discloses why number 10 turned down the appointment, I don't know.
And can you just flesh out what happens now? Because it's going to be a long recruitment process. Had the recruitment process started after you were formally told you were not going to be renewed, how is that recruitment process happening? And given that you have no deputy, which is one of the weaknesses in the structure which you've highlighted, how potentially damaging could that be if there's going to be a gap of 6, 9 plus months effectively?
I specifically, I don't know when the post was reappointed, but when the post was re-advertised, I don't know. But I can detail the areas that will be impacted by that lack of reappointment, and actually most of these are areas that would have been that would be impacted irrespective of whether or not the dismissal. These are sort of longer term issues in relation to the reappointment. It means that the 15 outstanding reports will no one's going to be hurrying those reports up into the system. It means that the ongoing inspections that are underway at the moment, so that's the contingency asylum accommodation inspection, the barges, the big sites, the Immigration Enforcement Competent Authority, the Rwanda Country Information Report that was 2022, and my annual report for next year. Bear in mind, last year's annual report hasn't been published yet. All of those inspections that are ongoing and activities ongoing can't be reported to the Home Secretary, effectively can't be signed off. So they're just held in limbo as I understand it.
There has to be a chief inspector to be able to submit, let alone get the Home Office to publish a report. Nobody else within your Department of 30 can authorise those sign-offs.
As far as I understand it. And even if it was the case that one of the civil servants could sign it off technically, could send it in, there's no independent. I was intimately involved in all the inspections that we've undertaken, so therefore there is no forward being written by the Chief Inspector, there is no positioning in terms of broader connectivity between issues that might be necessary, that would be necessary for the Home Secretary to actually understand what the views were of the Chief Inspector as is laid out in legislation. The legislation is quite clear in terms of the Chief Inspector reporting, considering and making reports to the Home Secretary. So those are the ongoing reports. There are another 3 that impact as well. The next one being that there is no independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration for the judicial review that takes place in March, which is significant in terms of that individual or that appointment being an interested party in that judicial review. And there is no one to sign off or do the scoping work for the remaining inspections of last year's programme. And you'll be interested to know the remaining inspections. Adults at risk 4, which is particularly sensitive. You'll recall that was that commission was rescinded last year, but we proposed that we would continue to do it again. Small boats 3, so a third of a series of small boats inspections, which is particularly important. High performance visa routes, Rwanda country information, because we know that the new information has been made for Rwanda decisions and that needs to be inspected, so that's not now going to take place. The country information report on Georgia, and age assessment inspection. So that's the remainder of this year's programme that we can't now pursue, all of which we would have been able to do, otherwise. And then finally, looking forward to the draft of next year's programme, because I expected to be at least doing the work for next year's programme. That means that joint inspection activity with HMIC FRS into organised immigration crime, question mark, where does that go? Communication between the Home Office and Parliament, including this committee. We were intending next year to inspect that level of communication because I think that's been wanting in some areas. Deprivation of citizenship for non-conducive grounds. That would be another area that we were looking to deal. You'll recall that this year's report that hasn't been published didn't deal with the non-conducive, so the non-conducive is particularly sensitive. We'd recruited staff and got staff vetted in order to be able to do that. The second intelligence inspection, which first one took place in Humberside, we'd look for somewhere else to do that second inspection and that follow-up and really get under the skin of intelligence at the border. And then perhaps most importantly, considering recent events, comprehensive independent inspection of general aviation and border forces dealing with general aviation. So none of those, all of those were things that would have gone into next year's programme that now can't be done.
So we've only ever had you from your former inspectorate as a witness. There's nobody else amongst your staff of 30 who would normally be called upon to be scrutinised about the work of the inspectorate and its reports.
No, and it would be unfair to ask them to come. They are civil servants it would be, that's not why they joined up. And actually, the way that the ICIBI has developed means that the chief inspector is accountable for everything that they do, and is intimately involved in all the activity. And it's certainly one of the appeals of the job and one of the great strengths of the job.
So effectively, the workings of your department, its historical workings that have yet to be published and subject to public scrutiny, its ongoing workings in many areas which are urgent and certainly of great interest to this committee, and its planned workings are all effectively in limbo for the duration and beyond of the interregnum that is the absence of a chief inspector, which may be 9 months at least.
As I understand it, yes.
So that's a bit worrying, really, isn't it?
It's extremely concerning. This is, the work that we do is front and centre of life in this country, for the security of the country, for its future. It's on the front page of the paper. It seems to be almost every day of the week. So it's hugely important, and a lack of that oversight, a lack of independent oversight, a lack of someone that can explain to ministers what their view is of what's going on at the border or what's going on in the accommodation centres, I think is really important, and I think it's a great loss.
Added to which, presumably the Home Office now has to go to the expense of having sacked you and any redundancy terms effectively, rather than allowing your contract to come to its normal end if it were not to be renewed.
I've not looked at that. What I've done is sort to tidy up loose ends as best I can, prepare myself for the committee, and then we'll see where it takes us after that.
But if you've been allowed to continue just to the end of your contract, which is the end of March, I think it was in any case, then some more of this work could have been done, some preparations put in place.
Absolutely.
It's a cliff edge, effectively, where nothing can now happen.
So we'd have been able to set in place 2 of those 5 areas. Certainly we'd have been able to set the staff off on the basis of the rest of the inspection programme, and we'd have been able to bring the terms of reference. We'd have been able to submit the contingency report. We'd have been able to submit and come to a view on the Rwanda piece. So we'd have been able to put that in there. So we'd have been much better prepared than we would have been, as it is with the cliff edge, which really just leaves them, hanging in the wind, really.
And the fact that you have this slightly hybrid status as a chief inspector rather than Her Majesty's inspector, which means you don't have certain powers, and there's a whole issue around actually being able to publish regardless of the Home Office's reluctance or incompetence or delay. Is there any justification for that? Why was it set up differently?
I personally, 3 years in, I don't think there is any justification for it. I think that the sterilising effect of openness on the areas that we inspect is really helpful. Many of these matters are, as I said, are critical to our to the way that the country functions, and they should be aired. There is a public interest to get these things out into the public space. I just don't think that there's any reason why we should be any different, for example, to HMIC or HMIP. Just because the reports might be inconvenient, shouldn't mean that they're suppressed.
Well, I'm sure previous inspectors of constabularies and fire services, not too many feet from you now, may not describe themselves as not being a nuisance. So it's
Mr. Lawton, it's part of that. Surely it's part of the job. For me to be effective, for me to make an assessment of the effectiveness and the efficiency of what's going on within the Home Office, to a certain degree, you're going to have to make a nuisance of yourself, because the tragedy is that officials, professionals, don't mind criticism. They can improve the way that they do business, and there's a number of senior officials in the department welcome reports, even though they can be quite challenging. But equally, if it's, I'm afraid if it impedes the bureaucrats climb up the slippery pole, then they don't want that music.
I agree. I think my point was the distinction between being His Majesty's inspector and a chief inspector is not based on a nuisance quotient.
No.
They're there to do the same job, effectively. But you have not been provided, and your predecessors, with the same powers to do that job as you best see fit. So ultimately, do you think you've been set up to fail?
I think I've had to play a canny game over the 3 years. You'll recall in this committee before when I've been pressed on whether or not I should be auto-publishing my reports, and I've mentioned before that I'd taken legal advice, and my legal advice is different to the Home Office's legal advice. Has been borne out by events, had I chosen to press the nuclear button, which is a previous question I think that you'd had I chosen to press the nuclear button, I would have missed out on, the country would have missed out on 18 months of assessment and reports, because I'm pretty sure I'd been dismissed 18 months ago. And then we'd have had significantly less oversight, independence and confidence in the work that we do than we've got now. So I think I think it was the right decision not to go nuclear, and it has been borne out subsequently by events.
Thank you.
Thank you. Diane Abbott.
You said you were sacked by teams. That's relatively unusual for someone of your seniority.
It would have been nicer to have an interview, I suspect. It's it's not the best way to go home on the sort of 5:30 train.
And were you given any prior warning by the Home Secretary or his private office that you were going to be sacked?
No.
You mentioned, I think, in your introductory remarks that sacking you in the way that it happened is in breach of one of the terms of your contract. Did I hear that correctly?
Well, that's what the letter says, that I was breaching the terms of my contract. The point I was trying to make was that I think I've acted in line with legislation within the Borders Act and dismissed on the basis of the terms and conditions of a contract.
And do you think that the reasons for your sacking might have been inconvenient truths that you were raising with ministers?
I think, in my experience, moral courage, doing the right thing on a bad day when no one's looking, is a rare quality. I think that's why I was recruited. I think, look back 3 years, Ms Abbott, when you were questioning me on this committee when I was coming in, I don't suspect you expected that I would have displayed the moral courage that I've needed to display in this job. And it's every day. I'll stop there.
Just on City Airport, obviously I don't want you to go into it in any detail, but were the failures that you talked about, checking private jets, was this a failure to do immigration checks or customs checks or both?
I've been spoken to by the Cabinet Office and received a letter from the Cabinet Office, effectively restricting what I say about ongoing inspection reports. So I will be careful, and if I can, the report will be published, I'm sure, and then it will become clear. And I hope that the Home Office are taking steps now, immediately as a result of as soon as they receive the report, to be able to close down those areas. But at the moment, I think it will be putting me in jeopardy to go further than I've just gone.
So it would also put you in jeopardy to say whether there was any suggestion from the department that very high net worth individuals should be treated with minimal interference.
I've certainly not encountered that.
I was very struck when the minister came before the House to talk about your sacking, and he said that one of the problems they had with you, that you were putting out information that had no basis in fact. That was quite an extraordinary blunt thing to say on the floor of the House. You think you were putting out information that had no basis in fact?
I hope I wouldn't have put my reputation and my job on the line if I thought that I was putting out information that wasn't based on fact.
Why do you think the minister said that?
I can't tell you why the minister said that. I don't know who's briefed him or why he would have said that. But I don't know. The report will ultimately be published, and then it will come out, I'm sure.
Of the, I think it's 14, or is it 15 outstanding reports that haven't been published?
15, including the annual report.
which of the, I mean, obviously all the reports are very important, but which of those reports do you think, which 2 or 3 were the most important and you're most disappointed were not published?
They are all important, and as an independent and impartial inspector, it's equally important to have independent inspection that finds that in an area there is actually nothing wrong, and in fact it's equally important to find out areas are performing well. And so it's quite difficult to pin on something in particular. I think in terms of risk to life, and in terms of risk of damage, I think the revisiting, the reinspection of children in hotels is particularly important, because we found, you'll recall, a previously published report, significant errors. So I think that's an important, because it involves children, it's particularly important. I think that the asylum casework was clearly of a huge interest to the country, and that's a particularly dense report, and that will be particularly interesting. Social care visas, again, because of the huge mistakes that have been made. But they're all they are all important in their own way, and quite a few of those are inspections into the border force as well, which taken together can produce a pattern of performance.
And when you came before us, I think it was in November, you talked about the areas that we're dealing with, and you went on to talk about the unfairness that we are encountering, and sometimes the ineptitude or the poor things that should be found in public life. What sort of ineptitude are you talking about?
Could you just clarify that point again?
Well, it's what you said. We asked you if you wanted to be reappointed, and you said yes. And you said, as you increase in confidence, I'm sure you could try back and there'd be someone who'd be able to see that once I really began to understand the areas that we are dealing with, the unfairness that we are encountering, and frankly, sometimes the ineptitude or the poor things that should be found in public life. Did you use the word ineptitude? Because that's in our note of the meeting.
I'm sure I did. I can't sort of bring to mind exactly what I was referring to about the ineptitude. We see regularly in inspection work, not referring to the unpublished work necessarily, but in general, we see poor performance, missed opportunities, and I've sought to highlight that when I've reported. Specifically, I don't recall the ineptitude comment or precisely why I use that particular remark. But I have seen, in terms of the missed opportunities for things like asylum accommodation, I've mentioned at this committee before, earlier elements of asylum accommodation where lessons have not been identified, where lessons have not been learnt, where money has been wasted, where time has been wasted, and where people have received a significantly worse, lived in significantly worse conditions because of inexperience and, frankly, I suppose the aggregation being ineptitude, that things aren't being gripped, things are being let run, and we're not learning from the mistakes that we should be learning from, and at a speed we should be learning from. This is a huge department in the Home Office, and really there should be much more bite at this stage of the game, I think. That's not to say that that there is wide-scale ineptitude. There are some extremely good, solid people within the Home Office doing some really good work, but it seems to be that they're at the next sort of turn of the handle. So when the operations fail, you bring a new team in, and that's when it begins to sort of bite and begins to sort of impact. That should be at day one. It shouldn't be at the first turn of the handle when things have gone wrong, in my view.
And finally, Chair, you just now you said that lessons haven't been learnt in relation to asylum accommodation, and that's something which is of great interest. What do you mean by that?
Well, not straying into the ongoing asylum accommodation inspection, which is clearly an enormous piece of work. I think I've said before in front of this committee that the experiences of Napier Barracks 3 years ago, Napier Barracks and Penally Barracks, that was really poor. A year later, when we inspected, the Home Office had got its act together and the conditions were better. But then we didn't see the transfer of that experience into Manston, for example. And then we saw Manston was pretty poor. When I gave evidence last October, and we haven't necessarily seen the transfer of that experience into other sites. I think that you'll have lots more to say when these reports are published, but I think that there are lost opportunities, and I'm not, I wasn't recruited because I'm a former librarian. I'm recruited because I was former head of the military police. So it's really important that we're talking about hard-edged delivery matters here. Value for money. Dealing with people, respectfully. Just the reality, frankly, of dealing with large groups of people. It can be done, better, and that's been my experience.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair.
Just on that point of dealing with people respectfully, you mentioned the Cabinet Office had written to you. Was that a threatening letter that they wrote to you?
It wasn't a threatening letter. It was a formal letter that's deterred me from, had I not got that letter, I might be a little bit more open in terms of where I was before, but it's been brought to my attention, conditions that as part of my contract mean that, these matters will be treated confidentially. So I know in the future I'll be able to speak with much more passion and detail in response to your questions, but I can take a warning the same as anyone.
Warning.
Or a restatement of the terms of my contract.
Okay, and of course, anything that's said in front of this committee is covered by parliamentary privilege, and no action, as I understand it, can be taken from anything that's said to this committee.
No, I understand that, but it would be, having been given a direct steer, then it would be wrong of me to go beyond to completely countermand that letter.
Right, okay, thank you. Kim Johnson.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks for being here this afternoon, David. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the points that were raised just then about asylum accommodation, because 2 of your 15 reports are linked to accommodation, and I know that you have been critical of the lack of a government strategy on asylum accommodation. So I just wanted to know from your point of view in terms of what needs to happen now. And I think there has been some issues in terms of the cost and value for money, because I've raised in front of Michael Rycroft the fact that some of the people responsible for providing accommodation are making massive profits. And I just wanted to know whether you'd been able to see any of those accommodation contracts, or whether you've been obstructed from those contracts, David?
I've not been, as part of this inspection, been obstructed from seeing any of those contracts. It's not something, it's a specialist business. We're a team of generalists, so therefore we made the conscious decision in the scoping of that inspection and previous inspections not to look in any great detail into the contracts. You'll recognise that the NAO is a much better organisation, a more expert organisation to be able to look into that, and then we have regular meetings with the NAO to deconflict our programme with their programme in order that they can get into the skin of the contracts. I think that I'm not suggesting we take the path of least resistance, which is why one of those 10 matters needs to be ironed out. There needs to be clear powers given in order that we're not having to fight with the Home Office to get information if that's what we chose to do. So, but I think I've been able to do my job, perfectly effectively without access to those contracts. But there will come a time when it's absolutely critical. I think the numbers, certainly the numbers in contingency asylum accommodation at certain sites is, the more people that are there, the cheaper the cost per day, and then the cheaper the headline figure. It's not something that we've inspected, but clearly the more people that are in a site, the greater the capacity, the harder it is, the harder the site is being worked, so therefore the conditions can be less good, and therefore the happiness of the individuals who are in it can decline as well. But so no, not specifically. We've not been obstructed, and had we been obstructed, then I would have clearly made I would have made a fuss about that.
Well, that's good to know. But I just wanted to know your opinion on the likes of Serco, who make millions of pounds in profit from the public purse, and whether, those profits should be handed back to the Home Office so that that money could be better used elsewhere.
It's not something that we've looked at. It's not something I'm going to commit to. It's something that ministers often ask, and I've given the same response that I've done to ministers. It's not something that we've looked at. They're very interested. Previous ministers have been very interested in the performance of the firms, and all of them. There are positives and there are negatives, but I don't have a view on whether the money should be handed back.
I suppose one of the negatives was what was alluded to just earlier on about, poor quality accommodation and some abuse taking place of people living in those accommodations. And I don't know whether that's been covered in any of those reports that you've highlighted. And I welcome your optimism in that, you believe that those reports will be published anytime soon. And what you believe needs to happen to ensure that that level of abuse that is being undertaken in some of those establishments is stopped.
Well, certainly, independent oversight isn't a bad thing, because actually, when we speak to stakeholders, they will point us in the direction of sites within constituencies, if those are political stakeholders, and we will include them or can include them within our inspection. And we've done a specific inspection at hotels in Northern Ireland, families in hotels in Northern Ireland, in particular in response to one of those requests. So I think that the fact that the intelligence that we receive, confidential intelligence and intelligence that we receive from stakeholders, allows us to go when and where, and hopefully gives some level of assurance, even if those reports aren't immediately published.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. James Daly.
Mr. Neal, can I apologise for coming in late? I was unavoidably detained. Can I just ask you, just to understand, there's two, you've mentioned your contract a lot in respect of these discussions, and I just wanted to understand if this is correct, that in line with the notice provision in your contract, rightly or wrongly, you were given notice that your 3-year tenure was not coming to an end. Is that correct?
Right.
And whether that was the right decision or not, that was in line with the contractual provisions of your contract. And I understand that when we talk about your employment being terminated rather than you being given notice, there appears to be the leaking of information to the Daily Mail. Is that correct?
That's what's been said, yes.
Okay, and you deny that?
I'm not. As I said right at the beginning, what I'm in the business of doing was I'd encountered a series of events that I thought was a risk to the country. We didn't. There were 15 reports held up at the moment. I sought a meeting with the appropriate minister to discuss that and others, and that meeting was turned off.
Well, I understand all that, and I appreciate that, but you leaked the information to the Daily Mail, didn't you?
I'm not. I didn't leak.
Yes, Mr. Neal. Is that just
no? I didn't leak. I didn't leak information. What I've done is I think I've done what I needed to do in terms of how the legislation expects the independent chief inspector to behave, which is to monitor and report on the effectiveness
comments to the Daily
efficiency.
Mail. Is that what the legislation requires you to do?
Clearly, the legislation doesn't require us to comment to the Daily Mail, but it does.
You did, though, didn't you?
It does require us to expose. I think there is a higher calling here that it does require us to expose, what's going on, and if there's something going on that I think is a risk to the country, then I think there is a duty to expose it.
Okay. Just going back to absolute basics of your role. In terms of what your contract told you about your role, what is it? What is your job? I know what the title of your job is, but what is it to do?
It's to monitor and report on the effectiveness and the efficiency of a series of services that are provided.
And you are responsive to when the Home Office require you to do that, or is there a legislative requirement that you have to do so many reports a year, or within a certain time frame?
We can just, frankly, do as much or as little as I want. I consult the Home Office, and have done each year, consult the Home Office as to what it is that we might inspect. In fact, the General Aviation Inspection, for example, came at the request of the Home Office.
Forgive me, I phrased that wrongly. So essentially, you had the power, if I can put that's probably a bit of an overdramatic statement, but you had the authority to inspect whatever you felt was appropriate within the Home Office and what was going on within the Home Office in terms of your sphere, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And in terms of just so I understand it again, in terms of statutorily or the requirement of the government to publish any of these reports, just so we can understand what that relationship looks like, you produce the report, which clearly there's a contract in place, and you've done that with your team of civil servants. Is there a requirement on the government to publish these reports within a set period of time, or to publish them at all?
No, not that I can see in the legislation, no.
Sorry, just on that point though, there's an expectation that they're published within a certain amount of time, within 8 weeks?
Well, there is an arrangement. So, sorry, I thought we were talking about the law. There isn't in the law. There is an agreement that they will be published within 8 weeks, and that's only happened on one occasion out of the 45 reports that I've.
So just to understand that agreement is what? An agreement between who?
That was an agreement between a former Home Secretary and a former ICIBI.
Right. Okay.
It's effectively a local arrangement.
But clearly, in terms of if the taxpayer is spending a lot of money, in terms of 30 civil servants and an inspector to produce reports, it would seem common sense there has to be more than just a sort of handshake and I was going to say gentleman's agreement, but gentle person's agreement, if that's the right way of putting it, for these reports to be published. You would agree with that? There has to be some other mechanism, not just simply an agreement between two people in the past.
And there is a codified way of producing each one of our inspections that's agreed with the Home Office. That codified, so that set of rules has not been ratified by the Home Office, even though it was produced sort of 3 years ago. So it's all a little bit up in the air.
The only reason I'm asking these questions is clearly that if we're going to have somebody in your position, which we should have somebody, that carries the title and the responsibilities that you do, there surely should be some responsibility in statute, in law, or in some form which requires your reports to be produced, rather than simply it's at the whim of a government. I think is what you're saying, as to whether they publish them, because there's no recourse in law. It's on the basis of just something that happened in a discussion between two people a long time ago. So we need to put that in writing, don't we? Or there needs to be some legal requirement.
Absolutely, and the 10 points that I've written in, the points that would have been covered by a role and remit review, would have exactly done that, because I think there is a gaping hole in the legislation to do exactly as you've just described, to codify when these things need to be published.
Yeah, absolutely. My last two questions is related to Ms. Abbott's point, which I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact phrase that was used, but I'll use the word incompetent. Was it inscrutable? What was the word that was used? Was it?
Ineptitude.
Ineptitude. Now, very few people in front of this committee use the word ineptitude in terms of... so, when you were talking about ineptitude, I know you couldn't remember the specific mark, but I'm assuming you are talking about individual ineptitude, or are you talking about corporate ineptitude?
I think we'll be talking about the sort of corporate. I think we'll be talking about the Home Office, as a whole. We've seen through a number of inspections when there've been, opportunities that have been missed, when there's mistakes that have been made.
Because if you are going to examine, I'm assuming, Minister at the top, Minister makes a decision in terms of any of these situations here. It goes down through the management structure in terms of who has responsibility for that. I'm assuming that when you're examining how any of these things work, you look at that decision-making structure. Is it your evidence to this committee that you have been too robust, perhaps completely honest and straightforward, whatever the correct phrase is, and you've called a spade, and you've called out incompetence when you've seen it within officials, and one of the reasons you suspect that these reports aren't coming out is because officials do not want to be exposed by your very straightforward language regarding their competence?
I think that's probably a fair assessment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Chair. And just to follow on from that point that my colleague was making there, did you have a sense when you met with ministers that they had read the reports that you'd produced, that they were just kind of sitting on their desk in a holding pattern, that they'd been read, that the information within the reports had been understood by the ministers that you met with?
Not the reports, not the more recent reports.
Okay, because you're going
But
back.
they were initial interviews, the initial chats with the ministers, so I wouldn't necessarily have expected them to have gone into depth. Previous ministers have absolutely, have read the reports.
I was just asking because obviously some of these are going back to April last year, June last year. So in the period of time since these reports were submitted for publication, would you have a sense that the government has gone, yes, we'll see these things, we'll try and change these things before we publish the report, so that when the report comes out, the report will be critical of, for example, e-passport gates, but by the time it's published, we've fixed it and it's fine?
Well, and that would be one of the reasons why you would delay the publishing of reports, because often, using the previous example of small boats and Western Jetfall and Tughaven, by the time they'd sat on it for 6 months, the situation had completely changed, and the response from the Home Office can be a much, there's nothing to see here, everything's been dealt with, and we can move on. And that would be the disadvantage, looking at it objectively, as to why you'd want reports released straight away, because then those reports would be much more impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you think that's possibly the case with all of these reports, that they're waiting for other Home Office actions to correct whatever your report has told them?
Well, they've had if that is the case, they've had a heck of a long time to sit on all of these reports, which would, and similarly, if the current regime has had several months now to read these reports and clear these reports as well. So I think there is just a reluctance on the part of the Home Office to get the reports out. It doesn't happen to HMIC in the Home Office. It doesn't happen to Injustice to HMIP.
Yeah. What happens for your staff now? Because you've talked about the great team that you've got, the letter that's been sent by the various organisations working in the sector has been very complimentary about the way you've approached things, the way your staff have approached things. In the absence of being able to take any action on their own part, what happens to them now? Are they just in stasis until a new chief inspector comes along?
I don't know. I think a decision's got to be made. I think it's a crying shame, because we've got excellent staff doing a really good job. The contribution's been overwhelming, really. The support for the staff has been incredible. But so I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen to them.
Okay. It's certainly
worry. It's a worry.
It is a worry, yeah. Certainly something we can take up with ministers on that front, because having had your laying out your work plan, there's a lot of weighty things there that obviously do need inspected. I'm sure from my own experience of the Home Office I could add some things in there as well, but stuff around small boats continues to be an issue, and obviously something that you should be exploring. The adults at risk policy, again, really important that that's understood in the context of everything else that's happening, and immigration detention, for example.
I think that those, I've mentioned previously to the committee that it takes some time to get up to speed for any chief inspector, irrespective of their background. And they're coming into a new inspection programme that it's going to be quite challenging to really come to particular views about what it is that they're inspecting. You're more aware than I am how complex the legislation is, for example, surrounding it. So it's really important. And I think on that list of 10 things, perhaps there's an 11, which is set terms of contract. So an individual comes in perhaps for 5 years, so we don't end up in this position where that would certainly raise productivity. It would certainly give a better better longevity for the individual who is in the post, and I think that will be a sensible move. So perhaps point 11 there.
That makes sense. You'd mentioned in your 10 points that you'd made around the resources of your organisation being cut. Do you feel that's just a kind of spreadsheet type decision that's been made that everybody has to lose 5%? Or do you think that is to hamper some of the role and some of the scrutiny that's being done?
No, I think it's inspector. No, I don't think it's I don't think it's been done particularly to hamper us. I'm sure it's just across the board, but it has a disproportionate effect because of the growth in the area and the requirement for us to do our job. I took a decision at a very early stage that we had inspectors inspecting. So actually, we've stripped out the corporate services staff, and we just have teams of inspectors largely who can then focus on what the legislation requires of us, which is conducting inspections. So actually, to write the paper to justify a clawback of 5%, for example, actually detracts us from what Parliament expects of us. And we haven't got a great staff to combat the vagaries of Home Office whims. We've got a great staff focus on inspecting and getting reports into the Home Secretary and into Parliament.
Okay. Also, you mentioned around the importance of getting access to commercial contracts. Is there any kind of workaround for that? Because you talked about in your point about the ICIBI working closely with the National Audit Office to deconflict programmes to kind of get around these commercial sensitivities.
If I found that commercial contracts, there was a particular problem with contracts within an area that was in my inspection arena, then I would speak to the NAO and see what powers they had and see whether or not the NAO were going to unearth it. And I'd work with others to try and get after it. So I think that a team effort is probably more important, but clearly it shouldn't have to be a team effort because that slows down, that makes you dependent on others. To have that legislative power to do it, I think would be a really sensible thing to be able to do, particularly because often contracts and the money that's being made is a concern. But to be able to do that and to be able to do it well, we'd need to recruit potentially a different type of inspector who had commercial experience, and that would potentially slow us down as well.
Yeah, you need contract law specialists to come in and look at these things to see benefits. Yeah. And finally, on the point around the Migrants Commissioner, which is, again, a point of huge disappointment that hasn't happened. It certainly feels from the responses from organisations in the sector that they felt that you were quite approachable on that role and standing up for people within this system where there isn't really anybody to have that voice. Do you think that really should be part of the Chief Inspector's role, or should that be that separate Migrants Commissioner, or can both roles kind of reflect the needs of the people that are within the system? Well,
I think when Wendy suggested the Migrants Commission or recommended the Migrants Commission, I think for very good reason, because it needed, post-Windrush, there was an absolute need for people's views to be properly represented. And she saw that individual working closely with the ICIBI to inform the forward programme, to deconflict activity, to look at systemic issues, which was one of the points. Now, in the absence of any Migrants Commission, I've tried to do the best I can with speaking to groups and representing people. It's going to be no replacement for a Migrants Commissioner in the same way there will be no replacement for the Anti-Slavery Commissioner. So I think that if there is a requirement, that it should be a separate individual. But I hope that building on what I've experienced with stakeholders, and frankly part of the fun of the job, and I say fun of the job, is getting around and speaking to good people and speaking to new people and learning new things. And that's really important. And it informs, hopefully, the evidence of this committee, and certainly informs what I do, how we write our reports. It's critical. So I wouldn't want the Migrants Commissioner to replace that or those connections.
Is there a particular advice you would give the person that fills the role after you?
That's a really good question. I think don't press the nuclear button too early, I suppose would be the good. No, the advice would be absolutely, be true to yourself. You have to have the moral courage to do what's right. You have to keep in focus that there are real people out there. You have to keep in focus that politics is really toxic in this area, and you have to stand by your principles. Those are the most important things. All of this blows over, and then all you've got left is your principles. Do you sleep well at night? Which is a previous question. Yes, I do. But that's because I've got a clear conscience. I've done the right thing. Will continue to do the right thing. I just hope there is a role in public life for sure for people who speak truth to power. Every job that you look at these days will say senior job. Do you speak truth to power? How many people can actually say that they've done that?
Thank you. I'm just going to come back to James Daly for a short question, and then Mark O'Longy.
When you think about it, what you've just said is, well, it probably is a statement of the obvious, but it's absolutely astounding. So your evidence to this committee is, if you want a job like yours, is make sure you put a sanitised version of the event that doesn't offend anybody within the department, and then you might have a long and fruitful career. But if you actually put forward things in a straightforward manner and, oh my God, call people incompetent, that's the ultimate sin and you're out. Is that basically the lesson this committee is learning from what you're telling us?
That's your interpretation. I wouldn't go as far as saying then you're out, but I would say that...
It happened to you, so are you the example of my theory?
Well, perhaps I'm absolutely not the example. Perhaps I'm the least example. But yeah, I think you'd be fair enough. Some could say that I've been clumsy in the delivery of that, but actually I've worked very hard to try and not be clumsy.
What do you mean clumsy? What does that mean?
Well, clumsy. The civil service would like if everything was nice and sweet and fruitful and things running in straight lines, and life isn't like that. You've got to speak up, you've got to give and take, and you've got to speak as you find.
So your evidence, this committee, Mr. Neal, therefore, is that if somebody comes into the role, that takes up from you and has the temerity to criticise the civil service, that is going to be a major problem going forward for them in carrying out their duties.
I'm sure I'm sure the person who comes into this role, I'd be very happy to give them advice and be very happy
Well, I
to
think we know the
talk
answer
about
to
some
that
of
one. Thank you very
the
much.
pitfalls.
Okay, thank you. Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Without wanting to in any way diminish what is obviously an unpleasant set of circumstances for you, I'd like to focus my question on, rather than the vagaries of Home Office or who said what and when, whether it was Teams or Zoom, I'd really like to know if you believe whether the UK borders are safe and secure. That's what my constituents want to know.
And if I have, when I have conducted inspection activity and I've unearthed anything that would point towards an insecure board, then I've tried to represent that as best I can.
It's not really the answer to my question.
Well, it isn't, but I've not inspected all of the border. I've inspected certain things on the border, and when I've inspected certain things, then I hope that I've been able to bring out whether or not it's, whether or not the border is secure. I can't say whether, I can't make a blanket statement.
In your best judgment, if I had to press you on giving a view on this, based on your time in service and any changes you might have seen come about, do you believe, whether you would say they are secure or not?
In my best judgment, I would suggest that there is some way to go for the workings of border force, because that's one of the areas that we inspect, to work to its optimum level. I think we wouldn't be going against the grain from what Alexander Downer said in his 2022 report into border force, and I wouldn't be going against the grain of the Prime Minister's 10 asylum issues, one of which was fundamental reform of the border force, fundamental reform of the Home Office. I think there's a long, long way to go with the functioning of security of the border and the role that border force plays within it. And that's what I've tried to bring out in my reports, and some of the reports that are held up in the 15 will bring that out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've just been told that the 8-week agreement, commitment, was between Theresa May when she was Home Secretary and James Brokenshire when he was the...
Doesn't mean anything.
But just so we know, that was when it relates back to in 2015. So just so we're clear on that. I just wanted to... Oh, sorry, yes, I'll just come to Diana, and then I've just got some questions I want to ask.
Well, just looking at your employment history, in recent years it's largely been with the Royal Military Police. And I just wondered,
with who?
because you've not had this kind of role before, what most surprised you about moving from the Royal Military Police to working for the Home Office?
How long,
Well, Mr. Neal,
how long have you got?
I think the lack of leadership and the turnover of staff. I think that within the Home Office, for example, there have been 3 second permanent secretaries while I've been there. All the directors general have changed over during my time. Asylum accommodation, for example, over the last 18 months has been passed over senior leadership, 4 different senior leaders within that area. That makes it really difficult in terms of responsibility, accountability and authority, which is one of the, and it becomes a trope for the military to have wiring diagrams everywhere to make responsibility and accountability and authority very clear, and that's never clear within the Home Office. So the lack of accountability, the lack of leadership, I think is probably the biggest difference and the biggest disappointment as well.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to be clear, James Brokenshire was the Minister of State at the Home Office when he... Security and Immigration, as it then was, and he said the Home Office intends to lay reports by the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration within 8 weeks of receipt, taking account of parliamentary recess, as both houses must be sitting for reports to be laid. So that was back then. Tim Lawton.
Just to confirm on the record that last point of yours, Mr. Neal, that one of the biggest differences you have seen between your military career and structure and the Home Office has been the turnover in staff, which I'm sure you're right, but it contrasts greatly with the statement by the Permanent Secretary, the current Permanent Secretary as far as we know today, who said that one of the great strengths of the Home Office was its stability and the continuity of its staff. And yet you have quite rightly pointed out that every DG has changed in your under 3-year tenure. We've had 3 secretaries and many other senior civil servants in the Home Office relevant to your area have also moved on. Just to put that on the record.
And I think that impacts on stakeholder engagement, for example, on building trust, which is really important, particularly in an area where views are so diametrically opposed so often. It needs people who are competent, who can build personal relationships with people, who can trust and take risks with those people in order to deliver what they need to deliver. That's surely those are things that you have to do in life. In the army, on multiple occasions on operations, you would be sitting down with people who could be described as the enemy, but you still have to sit down with, you still have to negotiate with them, and you still ultimately have to deliver to get to the mission. I think that a little bit more of that in the Home Office wouldn't go amiss, because those people are not the enemy. Those are people who ultimately the state's responsible for.
James, did you want to come back in?
I just wanted again is when you say about diametrically opposed views, and I'm assuming in terms of civil servants, well, as far as I was aware, the civil servants do follow their instructions from the ministers. So whether people have got diametrically opposed views or not, that doesn't matter because you carry out the task at hand. Are you saying that the civil servants have diametrically opposed views to the ministers?
No, so
is there any evidence of that?
I'm definitely not saying that. And I'm saying about what I'm talking about, perhaps is a polarisation of the issues that we in society more at large, and then naturally the civil service, the same as everywhere else, reflects the society that comes from. But I've not detected, in the civil service, a bias at all. In fact, you
don't think the civil servants, some civil servants, are trying to hamper government policy?
I've not encountered that. And actually, in the wake of Windrush and in the wake of the face behind the case push that was in the Home Office, actually you encounter regularly civil servants at relatively junior levels, who are making really important decisions and are really thinking about the decisions that they make. I think that can only be a good thing, and that's no different to how we were in the army and how we were in the military. It's just dealing humanely with people and being sensible with people, and you get a better result at the end of the day, I think.
Thank you, Chair.
The Home Secretary has recently said that they were on the verge of publishing the 15 reports. Now, from what you've said today, I just want to be clear. Are you saying that those reports, they can still be published even though there's no Chief Inspector in role?
They can certainly be published, but there'll be no Chief Inspector to write the press release or comment on them in place.
Right. And have you had any indication, or before you left, when this shortly was actually going to be? Because
we'd speak every week to the Home Office to find out if they were going to be released this week, so no indication at all. Right, okay. And was the expectation that they'd come out one after another, or is it just going to be 15 reports coming out together in 1 week? Is that what? I think in the past there have been a sort of great... There's been a great report dump, and some of the stakeholders would say that actually that hides bad news in the reports, particularly the denser reports. But I can't say I've actually experienced that. But you would hope that to get the reports out there would be a start, and it would be silly to get them out over weeks and weeks. Some of these reports are quite short. The Portsmouth inspection report is a spot inspection report that's probably no more than a dozen pages. Okay, right. Can I also just ask you? We've visited the Bibby Stockholm earlier this year, and we obviously have some concerns about the Bibby Stockholm, and we were told about the very sad death of an asylum seeker who was living on the barge. Am I right in thinking that you too were concerned about that and had asked to see a minister to discuss what was going on? Not in relation. I was concerned about the conditions on the Bibby Stockholm, and after that tragic death, I visited, as part of the inspection programme, the Bibby Stockholm again for the third occasion. Right. The specific concern related to Wethersfield. Right. And there had been a number of suicide attempts at Wethersfield, and the specific concern that was this in the public domain, because it was a subject of a Freedom of Information request related to Wethersfield, and a letter that I wrote to the Home Secretary before Christmas about my concerns about Wethersfield.
Right. And did you have an opportunity to meet with ministers to discuss those concerns?
I did from the initial letter, and then there was a second letter when I went back to Wethersfield. And again, this is in the public domain because of a freedom of information request, so I feel that I can talk about it. On the second occasion, I intended to follow up a month later. We couldn't go because there had been a suicide attempt, or we chose not to go because there had been a suicide attempt, and it could be wrong to be disruptive by coming in from outside. So we left it another 2 weeks. So it was 6 weeks later that we went, and then it was sufficiently concerned that insufficient progress had been made in those 6 weeks that I wrote again to the Minister, and that was part of the purpose of the urgent meeting that I requested with Minister Pursglove to discuss those concerns with him. The concerns related to violence, related to purposeful activity on the site, and whether or not the Home Office had got the correct expertise with which to handle 555 men who were on an island marooned in the middle of nowhere. And in my experience, which in this area is quite considerable, I think there was a significant risk being run, and I made that clear to the Home Secretary, made that clear to ministers by letter.
By letter, but you didn't have the opportunity for...
No, sorry, by one letter, then meetings with both of them, and then a second letter when I followed up again. Had the meeting not been cancelled, we would have discussed it again to reinforce the point that that I was seeking to make. And it is a concern, the mental health issues. When we were chatting, and again, this is in the letter, so I feel that I can discuss it. When we were chatting in a focus group with a number of asylum seekers, an Egyptian nearly had a fight with an Eritrean in front of us. So that's the sort of level, that's not normal behaviour in any community, in any society, in any camp. That shouldn't be taking place.
Right, okay, thank you for that. And can I just also be clear, when you came before us in November, I think you'd said previously that you'd been invited to apply, or it has been said that you'd been invited to apply for the role again, open competition. Is that correct? You chose not to.
I'm not sure where that's come from. I haven't been asked to reapply. It's not. I think I would have remembered. It's not something I've been asked to do. If I was asked to reapply, I would love to reapply. It's a great job. But no, I've not been asked to. I've not been asked to reapply.
Right, you haven't been asked to reapply. Okay, I have a feeling that that was in the public domain somewhere. That I don't know if it was a minister. I think actually it was the Home Secretary on the 23rd of February. David was invited to apply to that open process. We've already started a recruitment process. So that's
not the case.
That's not the case. Okay.
If I was offered to reapply, then I would be delighted.
Okay, and the post, it was advertised last November, and the deadline for applications was December, and I think we were told that interviews would be in January.
As I understand there was insufficient people that applied, so this time I think it's been run through a headhunter in order to get a broader field of people, I think.
And I think the salary's increased by £10,000 as well.
Ironically, isn't it?
Right, okay.
Promise not to criticise anybody. You get the extra money.
Okay, thank you for that. Is there anything you would like to say to the committee that you haven't felt able to say in this public session? Because we're very happy to move into a private session if there's anything you'd like to say to us on that in that regard.
I think it might be useful, Chair, if we were to move into a private session, because then I can perhaps just close the book on a number of things.
That would be good. Before we do that, I just want to say, though, so this is on the record, whilst I think it has been a rather unceremonious end to your tenure as the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your clear commitment to the role, the excellent investigations that you've conducted, and your readiness to share your investigations and insights with this committee. I think your findings and recommendations have proved hugely valuable to members here, and I think all of us would like to wish you the very best for your future. So thank you very much for attending today, and we'll now move into a private session. We're going to finish the formal business, and we're going to clear the public gallery as well. So thank you.
The proceeding is currently in private. The proceeding is currently in private.